He was the man who turned Auschwitz into a factory of death, the architect of mechanized murder, a bureaucrat of genocide who claimed he was only following orders. Rudolf Höss, Commandant of Auschwitz, oversaw the extermination of more than 1 million men, women and children. But when the war ended and the Reich lay in ashes, Höss was not immediately dragged before the world's cameras. His fate was decided first in secrecy, in a hidden room by men whose own hands were not clean, in a trial that was never meant to be remembered. The secret trial of Rudolf Höss. This was not the Nuremberg spectacle broadcast across the globe. This was shadowed testimony, hidden files, and a reckoning that raised questions no one dared ask in public. Was justice truly served? Or was it managed, shaped, and silenced? Tonight we open those forgotten pages. We walk into the chambers where justice and vengeance blurred, where one of history's greatest criminals faced his accusers, not under the glare of history, but in silence. If you believe the darkest chapters of our past still hide truths worth uncovering, then subscribe now. Join us as we reveal the secret trial of Rudolf Höss, Auschwitz's commandant, because history does not whisper, it waits. The Reich had fallen, but its architects of death were scattered like shadows across a ruined Europe. Some fled to South America, aided by false papers and sympathetic networks. Others tried to vanish into the rubble of Germany itself, shaving beards, donning workmen's clothes, blending into the displaced masses. Rudolf Höss, Commandant of Auschwitz, the man who had orchestrated industrialized murder, chose the latter path. When Allied investigators first combed through captured SS files, they knew who he was, but not where he had gone. Höss had been meticulous in his duties at Auschwitz, signing off on documents that described the gassing of thousands as though they were logistical problems. His name was inked into the machinery of genocide. And yet, when Berlin fell and the camps were liberated, he slipped away like a ghost. For months, British intelligence followed fragments of rumor. Reports came from locals, a farmer who looked suspicious, a stranger who never stayed long in one town. Each lead dissolved into nothing. By early 1946, the Allies knew Höss had vanished into northern Germany, and the pressure to find him mounted. His testimony, his very existence, was crucial not only for justice, but also for history. Auschwitz was the heart of the Nazi extermination system. To bring its commandant into the light meant forcing the world to stare directly at the abyss. The breakthrough came through betrayal. A captured SS officer, hoping to shorten his own punishment, revealed that Höss had hidden with his wife's relatives. The farm was in Schleswig-Holstein, in the British zone of occupation. The address was vague, but it was enough. A small detachment of British soldiers, led by Colonel Hans Alexander, a German-born Jew who had fled the Nazis, set out in the bitter cold of March 1946. Alexander had lost family to the camps. For him, the hunt was personal. They arrived at the farmhouse under cover of night. The yard was quiet, the livestock restless. The soldiers forced their way in, demanding answers. Höss's wife, Hedwig, at first insisted she knew nothing, but under threat that her children would be sent to Siberia, she broke. With shaking hands, she pointed to a hayloft where her husband was hiding. The soldiers dragged him out, disheveled, disguised as a farmhand. His fingernails were black with dirt, his face sunken from months of hiding. He gave a false name at first. Franz Lang, he muttered. But Alexander, staring into his eyes, knew. They had found Rudolf Höss. What followed was not a gentle arrest. The soldiers, many of them Jewish, many of them carrying their own scars, beat him with fists and rifle butts. His mouth split, his ribs cracked, his body crumpled into the mud. In that moment, justice looked less like a courtroom and more like vengeance. Höss did not resist. Perhaps he knew resistance was pointless. Perhaps, in some hidden corner of his mind, he knew this moment had always been waiting. They bound his hands with rope, shoved him into a truck, and carried him through the night to a British military prison. Along the way, he began to talk, first in fragments, then in confessions that spilled out under interrogation. He admitted his role at Auschwitz, He described the gassings in detail, the efficiency of Zyklon B, the numbers killed as if they were statistics in an accounting ledger. The words chilled even the hardened interrogators. There was no passion in his voice, no hatred, only the cold detachment of a man recalling administrative duties. He spoke of murder as if it were logistics, of death as if it were routine. By the time the sun rose, the world's most wanted executioner was shackled, his identity confirmed. His journey from commandant to captive had begun, but when he was finally brought before a court, it was not the grand stage of Nuremberg. It was something far more hidden, far more secret, and far more disturbing. The Nuremberg trials dominated headlines across the world. Cameras rolled as Göring, Hess, and the other architects of the Reich faced justice before a panel of international judges. The proceedings were meant to be transparent, a public reckoning for crimes against humanity. But Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, did not walk into that spotlight. Instead, his first reckoning took place in silence. The Allies decided that before he could be paraded before the global community, he had to be broken down in private, his testimony extracted, his crimes documented with clinical precision. There were also political calculations. The Soviet Union, eager to emphasize Nazi atrocities, wanted to use Höss as a weapon of propaganda. The British, however, insisted on controlling the process. A secret trial would ensure that the most damning evidence could be preserved without interference, and that the raw brutality of his testimony would not shock the public into disbelief. The location chosen was not a grand courthouse but a military barracks hastily converted into a courtroom in the British zone of occupation. Heavy blackout curtains covered the windows. Guards with rifles stood at every door. Only a handful of people were allowed inside. British officers, Polish prosecutors, a few legal clerks and interpreters. There were no cameras, no journalists, no crowd of survivors to bear witness. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. When Rudolf Höss was led in, shackled and pale, he did not look like the monstrous figure the world imagined. He looked ordinary, too ordinary. A balding man in his mid-40s, shoulders slightly stooped, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. If you passed him on the street, you would never imagine he had overseen the deaths of more than 1 million human beings. That ordinariness was, in itself, horrifying. The judge read the charges: crimes against humanity, mass murder, genocide. The words hung in the air, but Höss barely flinched. He sat down, hands folded neatly in front of him, as if attending a dull business meeting. The prosecutors began with documents recovered from Auschwitz, transport lists, memos, orders signed in Höss's own hand. Each piece of paper was placed before him. At first, he denied nothing, nodding quietly as though he were reviewing past office correspondence. One British officer later wrote in his diary, "It was as if we were speaking to an accountant about figures, not to a man describing the death of nations." The secrecy of the trial created its own atmosphere of unease. The judges themselves wondered if they were participating in justice or in something murkier. There were whispers that Höss was being kept hidden because the Allies wanted his testimony shaped, his words molded to serve political ends. After all, who better than the commandant of Auschwitz to validate the very worst accusations of Nazi barbarism? And yet, the more he spoke, the less he seemed like a man bending to propaganda. His confessions were matter-of-fact, filled with numbers and processes, not slogans. He admitted to planning the expansion of Auschwitz, to perfecting the gas chambers, to overseeing mass cremations. He even described testing Zyklon B on Soviet prisoners, watching as they clawed at the doors until silence fell. The court scribe struggled to keep pace with his words. Each sentence was a wound carved into history. And then, at the end of the second day, Höss said something that made the entire room fall still. He leaned forward, his voice quiet, almost detached. "I know what I did, but you must understand I was not alone. This was the work of thousands. I was just the one giving shape to it." The judges exchanged glances. Was this a confession or an attempt to dissolve his guilt into the machinery of the Reich? Either way, the secret courtroom had heard enough to know that the truth of Auschwitz was more terrible, more systematic than they had ever imagined, but they had not yet heard the voices of the dead. Those would arrive next, through testimony that would haunt the silence forever. The silence in the secret courtroom was oppressive, as though the walls themselves strained under the weight of what had already been confessed. But confessions were not enough. To bind Rudolf Höss to his crimes beyond dispute, the judges demanded more: the testimony of survivors and the records of the dead. The first documents presented were transport lists, columns of names, ages and nationalities typed with bureaucratic precision. Each sheet represented a trainload of human lives deported from across occupied Europe. Warsaw, Paris, Amsterdam, Salonika, whole communities reduced to ink on paper. The prosecutors read the numbers aloud. To Höss, they had once been statistics to process. To the court, they were ghosts filling the room. Next came the reports from the Polish underground, smuggled out during the war at unimaginable risk. They described the chimneys of Auschwitz belching black smoke, the stench of burning flesh drifting for miles, the cries of children separated from their mothers. The officers who read these reports did so in flat tones, trying to mask the tremor in their voices. Yet every word scraped against the silence like a blade. Then at last, a survivor entered the chamber. She was a Polish woman in her 20s, her body frail, her eyes older than her years. She walked with hesitation, but stood upright when she faced the man who had overseen her torment. Her testimony was not dramatic, not embellished. It didn't need to be. She spoke of the arrival at the camp, of the confusion, of the guards barking orders. She described how the old and the young were sent one way, the able-bodied another. She never saw her parents again after that first day. Her voice did not crack until she recalled the gas chambers. She had been forced to sort through the belongings of those who were murdered: shoes, glasses, children's toys. Every day, she whispered, I touched what was left of the dead. Every day, I saw their lives piled up like rubbish. Rudolf Höss did not look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the table before him, his expression unreadable. Whether it was indifference or shame, no one in that room could say for certain. Another witness followed, a former Sonderkommando, one of the Jewish prisoners forced to operate the crematoria. His testimony was raw, fragmented, spoken through clenched teeth. He described the screams from the gas chambers, the frantic pounding on metal doors, the unbearable task of dragging bodies to the ovens. He admitted to numbing himself, to becoming a machine, because to feel was to break. His words ended with a sudden, choking silence, and he could not continue. The court fell still. The guards, the clerks, even the judges lowered their eyes. No one wanted to look at Höss, but all eyes eventually turned toward him. When asked to respond, Höss spoke calmly, as if discussing logistics. Yes, the chambers were designed to handle thousands per day. Yes, Zyklon B was chosen for efficiency. Yes, he had personally overseen tests to ensure the process was effective. His tone was clinical, but his words were monstrous. What unsettled the court most was not the horror itself, but the casualness with which he described it. No hatred, no rage, just the cold detachment of a man who had once managed a farm, then managed a factory of death. By the end of the third day, the scribe's pages were soaked with ink and smudged by trembling hands. The survivors' voices lingered in the air like smoke. Everyone present knew they were hearing history in its rawest, most unbearable form. And yet, the central question remained unanswered. Was Rudolf Höss merely a cog in a vast machine, or was he the mind that made the machine run? That question would dominate the next stage of the trial, where morality itself was put on the stand. And in that chamber of shadows, one exchange would shake even the judges to their core. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents, testimonies, and Höss's own words painted a picture of systematic murder that could not be denied. And yet, inside the shuttered courtroom, another question began to surface. A question not of facts, but of morality. Was Rudolf Höss a mastermind of genocide, or merely a functionary obeying orders? Was he the architect of Auschwitz, or only its administrator? The prosecutors pressed him relentlessly. "You organized the expansion of the camp," one insisted. "You designed the methods of extermination. You perfected them." Höss replied with unsettling composure. "I carried out directives from my superiors. The decision to use Auschwitz as the main site of the final solution came from Himmler himself. I did not choose this task, I obeyed. It was the oldest defense of the Nazi hierarchy, obedience. The so-called Befehl ist Befehl. Orders are orders. To the judges, it sounded like cowardice. To Höss, it was the only explanation he seemed willing to give. But the questioning dug deeper. One of the Polish prosecutors asked, "And the experiments with Zyklon B, was that Himmler's idea too?" A pause. Höss shifted in his chair. "No," he admitted. "That was my initiative. The earlier methods were inefficient. I sought a quicker solution." The words dropped into the room like a stone into water. For a fleeting second, even Höss seemed to hear himself, to realize that in justifying efficiency, he had claimed ownership of murder. The judges seized on it. "So you were not merely following orders. You innovated. You improved the means of killing." Höss's reply was chilling in its honesty. "It was my duty to make Auschwitz function smoothly. I regarded it as a technical task, nothing more." The court fell silent. Technical task, the extermination of over 1 million souls, reduced to the language of logistics. It was a glimpse into the abyss of bureaucratic evil, where morality was replaced with efficiency and murder became management. And yet, some among the judges whispered in private that Höss's detachment made him almost believable. He did not rant like Julius Streicher, the fanatical Nazi propagandist. He did not strut like Goering. He spoke plainly, calmly, as though the facts were weight enough. That calmness, paradoxically, made his guilt undeniable and unbearable. As the trial progressed, witnesses continued to provide testimony. One Jewish survivor described seeing Höss inspect the camp, walking past lines of skeletal prisoners without so much as a glance. Another recounted overhearing SS guards say that the Commandant was proud of his work. Each voice cut through the courtroom like shards of glass. But the most damning moment came when a judge asked Höss, "If ordered to kill your own family, would you have obeyed?" The chamber froze. Höss blinked, his mask of calm faltering for the first time. He hesitated, then softly, "Yes, if it were ordered." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Guards exchanged glances. Even the clerks lowered their pens. In that single moment, Rudolf Höss revealed himself not as a man trapped by orders, but as a man who had surrendered his humanity entirely. The judges adjourned, visibly shaken. The question of guilt was no longer legal, it was existential. If obedience could excuse anything, then morality itself was meaningless. When the session ended, the chamber was suffocating with dread. The silence felt alive, heavy with the realization that evil had spoken, and it had spoken calmly. And soon, that calm voice would hear its fate, not in the blaze of public justice, but in the shadows of secrecy, where even the sentence itself seemed too fragile to face the world. The final day of the secret proceedings arrived with an air of exhaustion. The judges looked worn, the prosecutors gaunt from sleepless nights, and even the guards seemed unnerved by the monotony of horror. The walls of the converted barracks carried the echo of too many confessions, too many voices of the dead. It was time for judgment, but unlike Nuremberg, there would be no cameras, no packed gallery of witnesses, no journalists scribbling in frantic shorthand. This verdict was destined for whispers and locked files. Officially, it would not exist. The presiding judge entered with deliberate gravity, his black robe brushing the floor. Höss was led in, his chains clinking softly, his face blank. If he felt fear, it was hidden behind that same mask of bureaucratic calm. He stood before the bench, the weight of his crimes pressing down on everyone in the room, everyone but him. The charges were read again: war crimes, crimes against humanity, mass extermination. The evidence was recited: documents, testimonies, confessions. There was no doubt, no ambiguity. The only question left was punishment. One by one, the judges spoke. Their voices were low but firm. Death. Death for the man who had made Auschwitz the epicenter of the Holocaust. Death for the engineer of industrialized murder. Death for Rudolf Höss. And yet the declaration was made not with triumph but with unease. There was no applause, no sense of closure, only silence. The enormity of his crimes dwarfed the sentence itself. A single life could never balance the weight of 1,000,000 lost. Justice, here, was both necessary and impossibly small. The sentence was signed in ink and sealed in folders marked confidential. Outside that courtroom, few would know what had been said or how it had been delivered. The Allies feared that the full extent of Höss's testimony might overwhelm the fragile post-war order, or worse, that deniers might exploit the staggering numbers to sow doubt. For now, secrecy seemed safer. Höss was escorted back to his cell, the verdict echoing faintly in his ears. Still, he remained expressionless. Later, guards reported that he asked for nothing, not a Bible, not a cigarette, not even a glass of water. He sat quietly on his cot, staring at the floorboards as though waiting for time itself to run out. But secrecy came at a cost. Even among the judges, a gnawing question lingered. Had they truly rendered justice or merely managed it? By hiding the trial, had they dishonored the victims whose voices demanded to be heard in the open? Or was this hidden process the only way to preserve the fragile dignity of truth in a world not yet ready to confront it? That night, one of the clerks wrote in his diary, "We delivered the sentence, but we delivered no peace. The man is condemned, but the shadow of Auschwitz will live longer than any of us." The gavel had fallen, but the chamber remained haunted. Everyone present knew that this was not the end. Höss still had to face the world, to walk the last steps from judgment to execution. And in those final days, his mask would crack, revealing not just the monster of Auschwitz, but the frail, ordinary man who had made monstrosity possible. And when the time came for his final reckoning, it would not be hidden in shadows. It would be on the gallows, before witnesses who would never forget. The sentence had been delivered in whispers, sealed in secrecy, but its fulfillment could not remain hidden forever. Rudolf Höss, the former commandant of Auschwitz, was now a condemned man. His final days unfolded in a stark prison cell in Warsaw under Polish custody, as the machinery of justice moved quietly but inexorably toward his end. In those last weeks, Höss began to write. Guards provided him with paper and ink, and he filled page after page with reflections, memories, and explanations. Some saw it as a confession, others as a cold justification. He wrote of his childhood, of joining the SS, of his years transforming Auschwitz into a place of mechanized death. He described the gas chambers in chilling detail, how Zyklon B was chosen, how the buildings were expanded to handle capacity, how the crematoria ran day and night, but woven into the dry prose were glimpses of something else. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. "I have committed terrible crimes," he wrote. "I should pay the price." And yet, even in these moments, he slipped back into the language of a bureaucrat, tallying victims as though they were figures in an accountant's ledger. To the guards who read his words, it seemed as though he could never fully comprehend the human cost of his actions. Still, there were cracks in the mask. In rare conversations, he admitted nightmares, visions of children's faces, cries that echoed in his sleep. One priest who visited him reported that Höss sought absolution, though whether it was sincere repentance or a final grasp for peace, no one could say. The day of execution was set, April 16th, 1947. Fittingly, it would take place at Auschwitz itself, within sight of the gallows built beside Crematorium 1. Justice would be rendered not in secret, but in the very place where his crimes had scarred the earth. At dawn, the convoy departed from Warsaw, carrying Höss under heavy guard. The road to Auschwitz was long and silent. Outside the windows, spring was returning to Poland, the fields green again, the trees budding. For the man in chains, it must have been a cruel contrast, life reborn against the backdrop of death he had sown. When the convoy reached the camp, survivors and officials awaited. The gallows had been constructed deliberately, not far from the crematorium where thousands had perished. It was symbolic, almost ritualistic. His death would occur within sight of the machinery he had once overseen. Höss was led out, pale but steady. He wore a simple prison uniform, his hands bound tightly. Witnesses later described him as calm, even detached, though his eyes flickered toward the crematorium, as if unable to look away. Perhaps, in that final moment, the enormity of what he had done pressed down at last. The Polish executioner read the sentence aloud. There were no speeches, no defiance, no final words of bravado. When asked if he had anything to say, Höss reportedly shook his head. Some accounts claim he murmured a final request for forgiveness. Others insist he remained silent. The noose was placed around his neck. The trapdoor creaked. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the faces of survivors watching, the silence of the camp heavy as stone. Then the lever was pulled. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, was gone. The crowd did not cheer. There was no triumph in the air, only a solemn gravity. Justice had been served, but the void left by 1,000,000 dead could never be filled. His body was left hanging for a time, a grim reminder of what had been and what could never be undone. Then it was taken down and buried in an unmarked grave, erased from the earth he had poisoned. And yet his writings survived. They remain today as both evidence and warning, pages filled with the voice of a man who reduced humanity to numbers, who built an empire of death in the name of obedience. They reveal how ordinary, how disturbingly mundane, evil can appear. In the end, Höss was not a monster in appearance, not a madman foaming at the mouth, but an ordinary man who surrendered his conscience to ideology and efficiency. That ordinariness is perhaps the most terrifying truth of all. The secret trial, hidden from the world, had brought forth testimony that still echoes across decades. The public execution at Auschwitz was the visible closing act. Together they remind us that justice, however flawed, must be pursued, not only for the sake of the dead, but for the living who must carry memory forward, because Auschwitz was not built in silence. It was built with words, orders, signatures, and the compliance of men like Rudolf Höss. And if history teaches us anything, it is that silence allows such horrors to rise again. So as we close this story, we ask you, what does justice mean in the face of crimes that defy comprehension? Can a noose ever balance the scales against 1,000,000 lives? Let us know in the comments below. Your thoughts, your voices, your questions, they matter. And if you believe stories like this must never be forgotten, subscribe now. Join us as we continue to uncover the hidden truths, the forgotten files, the moments where humanity failed and where sometimes it found the courage to resist. Because history is not just the past. It is a mirror, and it is waiting for us to look.